Welcome back. We're going to talk about quite a strange entry into the books of 1970 horror. Today, we're going to talk about Horror of the Blood Monsters, directed by Al Adamson. Now, this movie is strange in many ways, and let's see, where should we start? Well, first of all, this movie is only kind of a 1970 movie. It was released in 1970, but it was actually made in 1967. And you can kind of tell the aesthetics they look more 60s than anything. Okay, but that's not one of the weirdest things about this. So, this movie is actually pieced together from a few other movies. The main movie that is really going on here is called Tagani. Tagani was the English title for a Filipino movie that was made in 1956. I cannot pronounce the Filipino name for it. So, Al Adamson acquired the rights for this movie, and it really wasn't good enough to just show in the United States. So he shot footage and then combined it with this Filipino movie, and then also sprinkled in little scenes from 1 Million BC and The Unknown World. Just a little bit of each of those, some creature shots. So basically, what's going on here is the beginning of the movie opens with vampires. And the vampires are, drinking the blood of humans on Earth or whatever. And so then the rest of the movie is then framed as how did vampires get to be here? And it turns out that vampires were originally aliens. So even though this original Filipino movie is not an alien movie, Al Adamson made it an alien movie. So what happens is we have a crew of American astronauts, and they go out into space and land on a planet, and this planet is full of all different creatures. Now, the original Filipino movie was a caveman movie, a prehistoric caveman movie, where these different caveman tribes are fighting each other, and there also happen to be a few other creatures on the Earth or whatever. So, what Al Adamson does is he sews together other movie clips, and so now it looks like there are not only space cavemen, but dinosaurs, giant lizards, and then there's also, as you can see here on the poster, bat demons, claw creatures, and snake men. Now, in the original Filipino movie, one of the way you can distinguish the two tribes is one of the tribes has these long teeth. And so Al Adamson has changed it so that those teeth are fangs, vampire fangs. Okay, that's not the original intention. So now they're vampire fangs, and the reason why we have vampires on Earth is because these astronauts went up to space at one point and, basically were put into contact with vampires on another planet. So that's that. Now here's probably the craziest thing. The original movies that he used were all in black and white, but the footage he shot was in color. Also, by the time 1970 rolled around, every movie was in color. There wasn't really much black and white. By the mid-60s, black and white was pretty much gone, except for ultra-low budget stuff. You may remember Multiple Maniacs was in black and white. That's because Roger Waters couldn't afford a color camera in 1970, so that's why that was black and white. But for the most part, we have color. The only other black and white movie I think of 1970 was, let's see, what's it called? Sorry, it's the guy's name. It's basically the ripoff of Rosemary's Baby. It's gonna come to me, but anyway. That one was black and white because it actually was originally color, and then the color film was lost and only a black and white version was remained, so we watched that one in black and white. Darn, it's bothering me that I can't remember the name of that. But anyway, It was a pretty forgettable movie anyway. So, in order to pretend that it's in color, if you look closely here, actually, right here it says all new, all color. And down here it says color by Spectrum X. Well, there's no such thing as Spectrum X. Al Adamson just made that up. And what he does is he puts color filters over the black and white footage. But like randomly. At first I thought maybe like scenes with the claw monsters would be green and scenes with the bat demons would be red or something like that. Now, it's just random. And so then in order to explain that, there's this whole section in the middle of the movie that makes almost no sense, where it's like a scientist who's having sex with a woman, but they're hooked up to these like colorful lights. And like in between sex sessions, he explains to her that on the other planet, the atmosphere is almost the same as Earth, except there's a chemical in the air. And depending on the concentration of the chemical in the air, we get a different like filter, and red is the most dangerous filter. So when it's red out, then the people are being poisoned the most. But the astronauts don't know that. So anyway, it's pieced together. Most people consider this to be a really horrible movie. I kind of liked it because the claw creatures were cool. The bat demons were cool, like very cool. Now these were originally in the Filipino film. So the coolest parts of this movie are these creatures, and the claw creatures looked pretty good, especially considering the Filipino movie came out in 1956. And there's a fight between alien vampire cavemen and claw creatures that live in this water, and they like, kind of clip the cavemen, and they have to fight. Also, the snake men, there's like a 2-second shot where like a snake is coming out of a guy's, I don't know, face or something. And that is why it says snake men on the poster. But there's almost no snake men in the movie. It's mainly an alien caveman movie. Anyway, the other important piece that I should mention is that most of the actors are totally unknown. Al Adamson, used his little crew of actors to do most of his movies. He had done one horror movie before this called Blood of Dracula's Castle, and I watched a third of it, but it was pretty rough, so I couldn't get through it. I also watched a poor quality bootleg version. And anyway, other than this, or I guess part of this crew of actors is John Carradine, who is like a big actor that started acting in the 30s and was getting lead roles by the 40s. Here's a picture of him. That's John Carradine in Horror of the Blood Monsters. He's the one astronaut that doesn't get out of the ship. I don't know if he couldn't do the scenes because he's old by this point, but he just sits in the ship and kind of barks orders at everybody else. And that's all he really does in this movie. Here's a picture of John Carradine as Dracula, because he played Dracula in 2 of the Universal classic monster movies. He was Dracula in House of Dracula and in House of Frankenstein, which might be the 2 best Dracula movies in my opinion. I personally like when Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Wolfman all come together and get into hijinks with each other. So he was the Dracula of 2 of those 3 monster mashup movies. In the last one, Bela Lugosi came back and reprised his original Dracula role. So anyway, John Carradine, he was like I said, he was playing leads. He was in, I think it was called Return of the Zombies or Revenge of the Zombies in 1942, and he was the lead in that. So from 1942 all the way to technically 1967 when this was made, still doing horror movies and still playing parts. The thing about this that is even stranger is that I read an interview that was, I believe, older than 1967, where John Carradine said he didn't enjoy acting in horror movies at all. So it's strange to me that not only is he the lead in a horror movie, but he's the lead in many Al Adamson horror movies, which are some of the worst movies of the day. They're bad. Like I said, I enjoy this, but this is mainly not his movie. It's mainly this other Filipino creature feature. that he, touched up. So I don't know why John Carradine, if he hates horror movies so much, he went from being in good ones to being in these. He was in Blood of Dracula's Castle. He wasn't even Dracula in it. He wasn't even the lead. He was like a henchman in it. I wonder if he just took whatever part he could, whatever part he was offered. It's very strange. He kept working through the 1980s. I think 1986 at least. He was still doing movies. And so that's a pretty long span. I think from 1932 to at least 1986, over 50 years of being in movies, and many of them are horror movies. He's actually in 10 movies from 1970. Only 3 of them are horror. Besides this one, I didn't really realize it at the time, but he was in Bigfoot, which was a really bad movie we talked about on here. And he was also, I think he was in Crowhaven Farm, which was a TV movie that was also very bad. So he was just, acting in some of the worst movies of the year. But like I said, I do like this one. I give it a 6 out of 10 because anything I enjoy, even if I know it's bad, it gets a minimum of a 6 out of 10. I have to really be bored or annoyed by a movie for it to get less than a 6, because to me 6 is a passing score. So this one barely passes. 6 out of 10. I did enjoy it. I enjoyed it more than it was good, if that makes sense. I enjoyed it more than many other 6 out of 10s. And like I said, I'm just a sucker for these big creatures. I don't care if they're in rubber suits or whatever. It's a little bit too bad because the bat demons and the claw creatures each got about 1 minute of movie time, but it was still worth it. And even though it's a cheap strategy, I didn't even mind that he threw some dinosaurs and lizards in from those other movies, because it just kind of made it... It's a cool idea. Not well executed, but a cool idea. And the poster is awesome. So that's all I've got to say for Horror of the Blood Monsters. Oh, I do have to mention one other thing, because if you watch all these videos, you know that the last video was Scars of Dracula, and I mentioned that we were going to do Christopher Lee's 6th horror film of 1970. Well, I finally tracked it down and watched it. It was something that I had been looking for a while, and it was tough. Oh, I thought I had a slide in there. I was looking for it for a while, and it was tough to find because it's a German, Portuguese, Spanish movie. It's called Eugenie, I believe is how you pronounce it, which sounds French. It doesn't sound German to me, although I don't really know German, but that's definitely not the Spanish way of pronouncing that name. Anyway, Eugenie, I'm not doing a full video on it because, in my opinion, it's not a horror movie. I get why it's listed as a horror movie according to certain websites, because they do take someone's heart out in the beginning. It's very gory, and they do it again at the end. But other than that, it's more of a sex film. I've seen some sites call it a horror film, an erotic horror film, and I've seen some sites call it a softcore porn. I've also read that Christopher Lee was tricked into being in it. That was done by Jesus Franco, and Jesus Franco did Dracula, El Conde Dracula, the Count Dracula, with Christopher Lee, and he also did The Bloody Judge. That was the English version. I think it was called The Throne of Fire originally in Italy. The Throne of Fire, or The Bloody Judge, with Christopher Lee as the Bloody Judge. So he played the titular character in both of Jesus Franco's horror films from 1970. And so then in Eugenie, he plays this sadomasochistic narrator, but he only is talking in the beginning and the end, and behind him are naked women being strapped up, and supposedly, according to this thing I read, he didn't know that they were naked. And when he turned around, they threw a sheet over them. So he didn't know they were being filmed naked and that he was talking over a softcore porn. Anyway, it doesn't get its own video. I did not like it. It is a relatively well-rated movie. So whoever likes that movie is probably going to be mad that I didn't like it, or disappointed, I should say. No one's going to be mad, but someone will be disappointed I didn't like Eugenie, but I just don't care. I don't think S&M movies count as horror unless there's a lot of violence in them. You can't just stick a heart evisceration in the beginning and the end and call it a horror movie when the whole rest of the thing is just a naked girl running around. And it's like an artsy movie, which I guess Jesus Franco's movies are like artsy, except, I don't know, I just don't. Dracula was okay, but so far I don't really like his movies, unfortunately. Now, I know he has some bigger ones in 1971. He does Vampiros Lesbos, Lesbian Vampires, which I think is one of his, maybe his largest movie, his biggest movie. That's the next year, 1971. So we will talk about Jesus Franco again. And we'll talk about Al Adamson again, because he does Brain of Blood in 1971, and I think he does another one too. So, more on these two directors in the future. Hopefully the near future, because I've got about 3 movies left for 1970, and then we're wrapping this year up. And 1971 is a much more mainstream year for horror. 1970 had very few mainstream horror films, especially in the United States. I think that House of Dark Shadows was the only mainstream horror film that was American. So, of course, the Hammer films are mainstream, especially in the UK. And they were distributed by major Hollywood studios in the U.S. Hollywood distributors in the U.S., so they count too. All right, that's enough. I never thought that we would do 17 minutes of Horror of the Blood Monsters, but here you have it. All right, I recommend watching this because it's just ridiculous. I'll see you next time.